Hello and welcome to the March 2022 podcast from Monde, diplomatique. My name's George Miller, and my guest this month is Anne-Cécile Robert, who's director of Monde Diplomatique's international editions. Anne-Cécile has an article in this month's paper, co-written with her colleague on the editorial team, Hélène Richard, entitled Russia and the West, Between Sanctions and War. In it, they look at how the use of sanctions has increased dramatically since the Second World War, and in particular over the last 3 decades. It's been calculated that by 1997, almost half the world's population was living under some form of US sanction. Preemptive sanctions are supposed to prevent wars. They don't, as recent events in Ukraine have shown all too tragically. And now, the tough and ever-toughening package of post-invasion sanctions on Russia is intended to bring its economy to its knees and throttle its ability to fight. But we're in uncharted territory. Do we expect sanctions to do too much? That's what we explore in this interview. As Anne-Cécile and Hélène write in their piece, sanctions existed before the 20th century. But following the horrors of the First World War, they seemed to some leaders, such as the US's President Wilson, to offer a new way of avoiding escalation. It's worth underlining, though, that Wilson didn't envisage them as a soft option. In a speech in 1919, he said, "Apply this economic, peaceful, silent, deadly remedy, and there will be no need for force. It is a terrible remedy. It does not cost a life outside the nation boycotted, but it brings a pressure upon the nation which, in my judgment, no modern nation could resist." When we spoke on Tuesday the 15th of March, I began by asking Anne-Cécile to comment on this view from the dawn of the modern sanctions era.
Well, we can say that in Wilson's head, there were 2 ideas. The first was that we were fed up with governments and states sanctioning each other, waging war, and creating disturbances on the world stage. And the second idea was that we should find other means to solve our differences and our disagreements than war. So Wilson came up with this idea that maybe organizing sanctions internationally could be a way of policing international relations. So he wanted to end wars by finding another way of interacting and for states to deal with their conflicts and disagreements. And he wanted an international organization to be the pilot of sanctions. And he was not naive, but he was hoping that we could find efficiency in non-military actions.
And since then, I was looking at a graph which is produced by the Global Sanctions Database, an academic project, and it shows sanctions internationally that have been imposed since the 1950s, going decade by decade. And it looks like a mountain range that gradually rises from the left as we get towards the present day, and it becomes very, very steep. And that's particularly the case since the 1990s. So it's clear that sanctions have really become an instrument of choice in international coercion. And I wondered, if we focus on the last 30 years, can you say something about why that has been the case, and what would you sort of pick out as characteristics of their use in the last 30 years?
Well, it's very hard to sum up all the events and that occurred during this period. First of all, there was this period after the collapse of the USSR, when the United States and the Western countries were the leaders of the world, and they thought that they didn't have to wage war anymore. They could set their own rules, and sanctions were part of that of the arsenal. So the United Nations, the Security Council, was kind of a tool for Western countries organize the world the way they wanted, and sanctions were one of the most used tool for that. The second thing was that the war was, of course, not popular, but the idea was that sanctions could be a coercive way as close as war as we could get. So, as we didn't want to use military tools, we started to use sanctions more and more and more and more. So those phenomena combined lead us to a world of sanctions that are supposed not to be war, but that drive us slowly towards another form of war. Little by little, sanctions, and maybe we can come back to that afterwards, created some disturbances. They were supposed to police the world, but they started to create tensions where they were supposed to peacefully settle disagreements.
And you mentioned they were a way of avoiding going to war, so they're a way of minimizing risk to oneself, and yet to be able to say to one's own population, we're doing something, we're not failing to respond to whatever the crisis or the perceived problem is. So do you think the intrinsic problem is they've been used too freely? Or is it also that they're seen as a solution in themselves and therefore they can become a sort of alternative to diplomacy or other tactics, and that sanctions in themselves are a fairly blunt instrument that, don't have a wonderful success rate in solving international conflicts?
Clearly, we see that in Western governments' minds, sanctions are almost an alternative to diplomacy. And that's very ambiguous and tricky, because we need diplomacy. Sanctions are, especially when they are decided by Western countries, they are very partial. They express the point of view of certain countries. So they're unilateral. That means that we Western countries believe that we are right. So we can decide to punish some countries. We're so right, and we have no doubt that we are right. So we use whatever means available to exert pressure, which is, arrogant in a way. We may be right, and we often are right, but we may not be. So we find ourselves in a place where we don't discuss anymore. And in the world we're living in, where we have new powers rising, like China or some countries in Africa, and I'm not talking about Russia, we should be modest and try to discuss maybe and be more diplomatic than we are. We should use diplomacy more often. Also, because one of the things that is there that worries me a lot is that Western countries have started to use sanctions without finding any basis in the UN Charter. We set our own sanctions based on our own rules. And that's very dangerous, because we open ourselves to criticism of being arrogant, of wanting to organize the world according to our own interest, and sometimes of being selfish. The world needs dialogue today. Of course, there are many countries, many regimes that we don't like. And obviously, the Russian regime is a regime we don't like. But sometimes you have to compromise and deal with regimes. And even if you don't like some leaders, even if you don't like some regimes, you need to, pull yourself together and try and find a way to discuss. With Russia, it's too late, or maybe not, I hope not, but it's a real challenge today to go back to diplomacy. And if we look at the Russian crisis, Russia has violated international law and is committing war crimes. So Russia should be condemned, that's for sure. But we need to get out of this war. And the only way to get out of this war is to find a way of discussing with Russia. And afterwards, maybe we could find time to look back and understand how we got there. The most important thing to do today is stop the war, but maybe it will be useful in the future to look back into history and try to understand how we got into this mess.
And sanctions were imposed on Russia in 2014 after they entered Crimea, and clearly they failed to prevent this escalation. I'm guessing from what you've said that you wouldn't say the answer should have been tougher sanctions in 2014, that sanctions were, as we've been sort of saying, a way of being seen to do something, but it didn't resolve any problems. It set a marker, it expressed disapproval, but really it didn't have any, it may even have accelerated or strengthened the resolve of Russia to respond in an escalated way. So tougher sanctions in 2014 wasn't a missed opportunity.
Well, I'm so sad about what's going on. And Hélène Richard, who wrote the article in Le Monde diplomatique with me, and we've been talking about writing an article about sanctions for a month and years, and we are so sorry not to have done it earlier. Because the case, the Ukrainian case, could almost mean that we are wrong in what we say. I mean, what I want to say that it is so obvious that Russia is wrong that it could justify, as you just said, tougher sanctions and a more decisive attitude in 2014 to stop Russian mechanism and Russian willingness to use force. So it's. But if we just for a minute put Russia and Ukraine on the side and look at the global problem of sanctions, we could say that the problem of sanction is not necessarily to be tough or weak. The problem is the right definition of sanction and who is deciding the sanctions. And for the last decades, we have two problems. We have Western countries monopolizing sanctions instead of the Security Council. So the legitimacy of sanctions is questionable. And the second problem is the reasons why Western countries use sanctions are not always, as we started to say earlier, based on the UN Charter. I mean, we Western countries decide sanctions, for example, to punish a non-democratic regime or violations of human rights. Of course, defending democracy and fighting for human rights is a good idea, but imposing sanctions and organizing the world according to that is questionable, because any country can blame another country for violating human rights. The Chinese and the Russians, who violate human rights every day, often say to the Americans, but, well, we are ready to discuss human rights when you have settled the black problems in the United States. And, and they bring pictures of Black Lives Matter. And when France talks about human rights to China, China says, do you want us to talk about what you are doing in Africa? So nobody is really the white savior and perfect in this. That's what I meant when I said, well, we Western countries, more modest. But to come back, I don't want to avoid the question I don't like about Ukraine and Russia. My uneasiness comes from the fact that I believe that the Russian government has good arguments at the start. I mean, when Russia says, I'm worried for my security, I'm worried because I see that NATO is coming forward and is almost close to my own borders, and I can almost see NATO from my window. That's something we could have listened to. And when the Russian government took over Crimea, he was wrong. He can't do that. It's a flagrant violation of international law. But we created the problem in the first place, because we didn't listen to Russia's security concern. So I don't know if sanctions, tough sanctions or weak sanctions, were the appropriate answer to the question the Russian government was asking. We should have organized an international conference on security matters in Europe. And we could have done that in the General Assembly of the United Nations, or in Europe, I don't know, the Council of Europe, I don't know. There are many fora where we could have organized this discussion without being naive. We know what Putin wants, of course. He's not an angel, and he has made clear that he is a nostalgic of the Soviet Empire. So we know what he's getting at. He dreams of, Poland and the Central European countries leaving NATO and being some Finlands, we can't grant him that, of course. But I think we should have organized a big discussion with a lot of diplomats from a lot of countries to see that we could find a settlement or some answers to Russia's Security Council. Because as one former French ambassador said, even dictatorships have legitimate security concerns. I don't believe that Ukraine is a good example to put sanctions under the microscope. I think we are talking about diplomacy, history, security. It's broader, much broader than sanctions.
I did want to ask you, maybe we can sort of generalize this point about the perverse effects that sanctions can have, the undesired, undesirable effects. I was thinking about the bond that developed between Mussolini's Italy and Nazi Germany in the 30s after Italy was sanctioned when it invaded, occupied Abyssinia. And there's been a lot of talk about what the effect on Russia will be of the current unprecedented level of sanctions on it, such as strengthening Putin at home, increasing authoritarianism, and, of course, maybe the big one in terms of the geopolitical map is a stronger bond between China and Russia. But can I ask you to either to take that question in a very big sense, a bigger historical sense, or to focus on the immediate question? But sanctions can have undesirable and unexpected effects, can't they?
Once again, it's a very tricky question, because since 1998, when we evaluated the effects of the embargo that the UN Security Council have decided on Iraq, we came to the conclusion that it was so unfair because the population, average civilians and average Iraqi were suffering the most, while upper classes and government people didn't suffer any of the consequences of the embargo. So that's when we decided to change the regime, the sanctions regime, and we started to talk about smart sanctions, targeted sanctions. Targeted sanctions were supposed to be fairer because, for example, we draw lists of government people, police officials, military generals, and all that. So since 1998, sanctions are supposed to be wiser and fairer, but the truth is they are not. because even when you target important officials, the people suffer, because important people, by definition, they lead things. They are at the head of ministers. They have companies. They lead firms. So there are always consequences on average people. So, and sometimes, as you mentioned, people say, "Well, sanctions are unfair, and we are targeted because our leader is courageous. So let's stick with him. Let's support him." And during the last decade, it was the case in Sudan, in Kenya, in many African countries. So the effects of sanctions can be the opposite of what they are supposed to achieve, with the population sticking to with its leader. But sometimes sanctions work. We should remember that sanctions against apartheid, South Africa, were very efficient, and the ANC and Nelson Mandela himself were in favor of sanctions. Bishop Desmond Tutu, advocated in favor of sanctions, even if average South African and Black people suffered from sanctions. The sanctions against Libya, when Gaddafi was in power, were a success. If you remember, Libya had supported terrorist groups and didn't want to cooperate with the United Nations investigations. And the Security Council decided sanctions, and the sanctions were tough enough or efficient enough to oblige Gaddafi to recognize his responsibility in the attacks and cooperate with international investigations. So sometimes sanctions work.
Anne-Cécile, you mentioned a moment ago this sort of identification of the people with the leader and the fact that the people suffer, even if the people may not be responsible for the actions of the leader. And I wanted to finish today with a quotation I read from the American historian Nicholas Mulder, who's just published a book on sanctions, the history of sanctions. And he said in an interview with The Atlantic, if we embark on policies premised on the idea that bad governments and their people are one, then we have bought into a way of thinking that comes perilously close to how ultranationalists and fascists see the world. If total economic sanctions are the weapon to which liberal internationalism resorts to defend itself, then in a sense the totalitarians have won. And I just wondered, in conclusion, do you agree with that position? And if so, what do you think the implications of it are for sanctions now and in the future?
Well, this quotation brings us back to what I was saying earlier about Western countries' behavior. They use sanctions as a way to choose between the good and the bad governments and act as if they could decide by themselves what is right and what is wrong. And sometimes, and I don't know how things are going in England and in Great Britain, but in France we have very strange. We see very strange reactions. I mean, people refusing to read Russian books. I mean, Dostoevsky, or listening to Russian music because it could be interpreted as a way of supporting the Russian war against Ukraine. So it is true to say that sanctions sometimes are express a very simple way of seeing the world, between the good and the bad. So at the end, you don't make a difference between a people and its government. And that's always a defeat, because most of the time people keep their own mind, that their government make decisions. But most of the time people have their own idea and their own way of seeing things. And it's probably the case in Russia.
I was speaking to Anne-Cécile Robert, whose article in this month's paper, co-written with Hélène Richard, is entitled Russia and the West, Between Sanctions and War. You can read it at monddiplo.com. If you're a subscriber, you can also read every edition of the paper going back 25 years, as well as exploring other resources such as the podcast archive and online exclusive content. And if you're not yet a subscriber, there's plenty of open access content online to entice you to become one. In the words of John Berger, why read LMD? To make sense of what's happening in the world behind the misinformation. I hope you'll join me again soon for another interview with one of our contributors. Until then, thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.